Okay, the last thing we're going to look at is glottochronology. So this is a method for tracing the history of a language family, but it's not the comparative method. It's a very different technique, and it involves some particular assumptions about how languages change. Um, in particular, what glottochronology is meant to do, it's meant to give us a methodology for determining the date when two languages separated. So when did, say, English and Frisian split apart, right? When did they cease being the same language, the parent language, and split into the two separate daughter languages? The basic insight behind glottochronology is similar to the idea behind carbon dating. So I'm sure you're familiar with carbon dating. And so the idea there is that after an organism dies, the radiocarbon, so a particular isotope of carbon in its body, starts to undergo radioactive decay. It's no longer being replaced by fresh radiocarbon after the organism dies. And we know the rate at which that decay occurs. So what that means is that we can take the remains of an organism, we can measure the amount of radiocarbon, we know what rate it must have decayed at, so we can calculate the date when that organism must have died. Glottochronology is basically like carbon dating applied to language, except it doesn't use carbon. So the way it works, the basic idea is that since languages gradually replace vocabulary over time, we can use the amount of shared vocabulary between two languages to calculate how long ago those two languages must have split apart. Right? So if they share almost all their vocabulary, they probably split apart pretty recently. Whereas if they share only a small amount of vocabulary, they probably split apart quite a long time ago. Actually, what we're talking about here is when their ancestors split apart, right? So if we compare French and Hindi, the question isn't when did French and Hindi split apart, it's when did the ancestors of French and Hindi split apart. So when did basically Latin and Sanskrit split apart? In order for this to work in an explicit way, like carbon dating works, we can't just say they share a lot of vocabulary, so it was recent. They share a little vocabulary, so it was long ago. Right? In order for this to be a methodology that gives us specific results, what we need a specific rate at which vocabulary is replaced. Right? In the same way, we know the rate at which radiocarbon decays. That's what lets us do carbon dating. We need a rate at which vocabulary turns over in order to use that to date the relationship between two languages. So the people who do glottochronology say that, yeah, we actually can identify a rate. And so what they've proposed is that a language replaces approximately 20% of its vocabulary every 1,000 years. This is the rate at which vocabulary change supposedly happens. So what that means is that languages that split apart 1,000 years ago should share 80% of their vocabulary. That's what we expect. So in a formula, 0.80 is the glottochronological constant. Okay, so now if that's true, if this constant really is a real accurate thing, then we can use it, right? Then it's easy to tell the date when two related languages split apart. Okay, so you compile a list of basic words. So there's this sort of a standard list of 200 words that's often used. So you go to the two languages, you find those 200 basic words in the two languages, you compare the lists, and you count up the number of cognates. Right? So you see how many vocabulary items the two languages share, and then you plug that number into a formula that uses the glottochronological constant. Right? And that'll tell you what percentage they share. That'll tell you how far in the past they must have split apart, how many years ago they must have diverged. I guess that sounds kind of cool, right? It sounds kind of like a rigorous mathematical technique. So the question is that actually a valid technique? Does this actually give us real results? And it does seem like this is the only possible technique for dating languages that's at least potentially valid. It's the only thing that could possibly work. So maybe if it's used carefully, maybe it can give us some useful results, right? At least it's our only hope of getting any results of this type, because there's no other way to travel back in time to actually witness when languages diverged. But there are problems. Okay, so sometimes when you apply glottochronology to two languages, you get a time depth that just can't possibly be right. Okay, so if you apply it to French and Italian, they have 83% shared cognates. Right? And what you get is that French and Italian must have separated around 1586. Okay? And if you know anything about when Latin was spoken, that's about 1,000 years too late. Okay, so glottochronology isn't working out too well in that case. Basically, the problem here is that the whole idea that we can have a glottochronological constant, right, one constant rate at which all languages replace vocabulary, that seems to be problematic. It doesn't seem like it's necessarily going to be constant. So some languages seem to replace vocabulary much faster than other languages do. That can be a result of sociolinguistic factors. It can be a result of isolation. So one example, so Icelandic seems like it really hasn't replaced any words, basically, since Iceland was settled over 1,000 years ago. And there's an obvious reason for that, which is that Iceland is rather isolated. And so there weren't a lot of inputs coming into Icelandic from other languages. Right? It was pretty isolated from contact. So there weren't many reasons for words to get replaced by borrowing. So the vocabulary stayed pretty constant. And then at the other end of the spectrum, so the language Lomavren, which is now almost extinct, this was an offshoot of Armenian that was spoken by the Romani, also known as the Gypsies, and that it was an offshoot of Armenian, but it had virtually no Armenian words left in it. Almost all of the vocabulary had been replaced. And again, that kind of makes sense from the situation. Right? So the Romani moved from place to place quite a lot, and often had to learn other languages to communicate with people who they were around. So there were many, many inputs affecting that language, so there was a huge amount of borrowing into the language. And so that's why a lot of the vocabulary was replaced. So what we're seeing here is that the rate of vocabulary replacement, it's not constant, right? It depends on the situation that the language is in. So that makes it a lot more difficult to use the glottochronology technique. Yeah, at the very least, you're going to have to use different constants for different sociolinguistic situations, and then you run the risk of just playing around with, putting in whatever constant you need to get the result that you think is right. Okay, so the main points from this week's topic on models of change. So things that you should be familiar with. The difference between the tree model and the wave model, right? What do the two models show? What are they good at? And what are they bad at? The relationship between variation and change. So how does variation often explain how language change happens? Lexical diffusion, right? What is that? Why is it interesting? Near mergers, again, what are those? Why are they interesting? And glottochronology, right? What kind of technique is this? Is it valid? What are some problems with it? Okay, so that's it. I'll see you back in class next week.